Good evening, brothers and sisters. My name is C.R. Gibbs. The topic this evening is a hard road to freedom, slavery, and emancipation in the state of Maryland. We need to look back and understand that Maryland is unique. The state of Maryland is unique in how it arrived at emancipation, and in that it was the only state in the United States to end enslavement through the state's constitution. So that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing we need to understand is the size of emancipation. And in Maryland, and while it is wonderful to celebrate Juneteenth and any other freedom celebration you want, let's bear in mind that particularly for folk who live in Maryland, it may be useful to reflect upon how Maryland got that distinction, again, being the only state to end slavery through a change in the state's constitution. We also need to understand that we're looking at the freedom of over 80,000 Black folk in Maryland. That is important as well. Slavery was savage in Maryland. It's the truth is that it was, of course, savage everywhere. But we need to understand that here we are with one part of the state up against the nation's capital. That nevertheless there were magnificent struggles, and we never gave up in Maryland fighting. I want to begin with a little something from the second autobiography by Frederick Douglass. I really don't think it's used as much as it should be by historians and known as widely as it should be by regular folk. Usually we know about the life and times of Frederick Douglass. We might know about the narrative, but I want to just remind you that we do have My Bondage and My Freedom by Douglass. That would be the middle autobiography written in the 1850s. It would be useful if you are unfamiliar with it to reflect back upon it. I want to begin with a quote from My Bondage and My Freedom, which I hope will steer us into the right frame of mind. Quote, "There are certain secluded and out of the way places, even in the state of Maryland, seldom visited by a single ray of public sentiment, where slavery, wrapped in its own congenial midnight darkness, can and does develop all its malign and shocking characteristics, where it can be indecent without shame, cruel without shuddering, and murderous without apprehension or fear of exposure." If that doesn't get to you, how about this one? One of the commonest sayings to which my early ears became accustomed on Colonel Lloyd's plantation and elsewhere in Maryland was that it was worth half a cent to kill a nigger and half a cent to bury him. And the facts of my experience go far to justify the practical truth of this strange proverb. So even there are people today who would have you mistakenly reflect on how easy and gentle this empire suffering was. We need to know the people who went through it, not the people who showed up 150 years later and tell us without any iota, without any scintilla of personal experience, how good our ancestors had it. Maryland, the state of Maryland, had the nerve to call itself the Free State for far too long, when, as far as we were concerned, that was definitely not the case. The idea of Maryland, state of Maryland is about the size of the country of Belgium, and its primary source of wealth was the sweat and blood of our ancestors. We understand also that when we compare it to some of the nearby jurisdictions, which I don't think enough is done. I remember lecturing in, actually, it was at Oxon Hill High School. And the principal at the time was nervous about me speaking about slavery in, of all places, Oxon Hill High School. And so he let it be known, because I had been invited by a group of parents that I probably wouldn't get that chance again. He was concerned that my speaking about slavery, again, to the students of Oxon Hill High School, would somehow upset the handful of white students who still remained at Oxon Hill. That didn't matter that the majority of the student body might be of African descent, but he was moved by his concern for a small number of students who might who misunderstand. And to me, the solution to the problem was practical, because I could show where I got my information. I wasn't going to come into the school and say, let's do something to Whitey and, well, burn down the building. This truth speaks starkly enough for itself. And if we see, as we do with this particular illustration, an 1861 map of the distribution of enslaved people, actually in the DMV, we get a chance to see how dependent white wealth and prestige were on the institution of enslavement. But let's start in the center uh, of the map, where we can see Prince George's County, and it is 56.4% enslaved population. Montgomery, 32.3. Anne Arundel, 38.5. Fairfax, 27.9. Loudoun, 28.8. Charles, 62.5. So with this, we get a sense of how, although our work is unheralded and unappreciated, how it is that people who had legal custody of our bodies, but never our minds, luxuriated in the possession of our bodies. But we will see that we were a lot more, if you will, attuned to what was going on than they would have ever thought. We know that there is a industry, if you will, of slave plantations that still remain in, in the state of Maryland. One that almost never gets any attention is Belmont Manor. This is in Howard County. What we're looking at is the manor house at the Elk Ridge Estate, and that goes back to 1738. It was built by Caleb Dorsey, an ironmaster, and remained in the extended Dorsey family for more than 200 years. But the county, okay, Howard County bought the plantation house from the Howard Community College in June of 2012. In his will, dated May 21st, 1771, Caleb Dorsey, whose estate included over 90 enslaved people, gave one Negro girl to his granddaughter, Priscilla Prue, and two Negroes to his son, Edward Dorsey. Dorsey also bought and sold white indentured servants as well as enslaved African Americans. Dorsey and his descendants employed hundreds of enslaved Black people at Belmont and the nearby iron diggings and furnaces. There is an African American oral tradition that some African Americans who worked the Dorsey family plantations took that surname. In addition, coincidentally or not, the name of the only African American Civil War Congressional Medal honor winner from Howard County was named Decatur Dorsey. Many of the place names in the state of Maryland are associated with enslavement, as well as white prestige. From the book Annals of Silver Spring by Gist Blair. And if that last name might ring a bell to you, certainly throughout the district, Maryland and Virginia, I'm going to simply quote from the book by Gist Blair If any of you are familiar with the Silver Spring area, it is hard to walk or drive through Silver Spring and not be reminded of the wealth of the Blair family. Their apartment building complexes named after the Blair family. But let us go to Gist Blair's recollections, and he begins by saying the places of Riversdale, Arlington, Analoston, Duddington, and others were within easy riding distance and enjoyed by similar owners. These great estates and landed proprietors surrounded Silver Spring and the District of Columbia. Their owners and residents were wonderfully prosperous, possessed many slaves, and in part belonged to excellent families of English origin. They drank, were addicted to dueling, racing, cockfighting, and lived as gentlemen then lived. My grandfather loved the Silver Spring. It was there he enjoyed his friends, and as early as 1854, he gave his Washington house to his son Montgomery and settled down among his flowers and slaves and books. Not far from the spring were the dairy and quarters where the slaves lived, and adjoining them were the stables. My grandfather owned numbers of slaves, among whom Uncle Henry, the coachman, and Aunt Nanny, the cook, still figure in my memory. But my father never owned a slave. He represented a more militant attitude toward abolition. He is referring, of course, to Montgomery Blair. That may also be a name that you may be familiar with if you are familiar with the history of Montgomery County or that of a certain phase of the district. Gist Blair was the grandson of Francis Preston Blair, journalist, politician, and founder of Silver Spring. F.P. Blair, that's Francis Preston Blair, built 3 large homes in the area between 1842 and 1854 after purchasing nearly 1,000 acres just north of the district line. If we go a little deeper into Prince George's County, and we'll come across a plantation house called Bowie'ville. Now, while it gives the location at 601 Bowie'ville Man Lane, Upper Marlboro, Prince George's County, if you're unfamiliar with Bowie'ville, then I would have you in your mind's eye drive out of the district and come to Church Road. I know many of you know that place. If you take a right on Church Road and perhaps drive for 5 to 8 minutes on your left-hand side, you will see on a slight rise, Bowie'ville. Bowie'ville. And if that name sounds familiar, yes, we're talking about one of many plantations connected to the Bowie family. This is how it's described in the Maryland's National Registry of Properties. It too is of brick construction, covered with stucco. Bowie'ville, an elegant federal style mansion, thus reflects the wealth and social standing of the county's elite. The property itself was a tobacco plantation, as the 1826 appraisal also lists 6 new and 3 old tobacco houses. The inventory of her personal property also indicated that he owned at least 2 dozen enslaved people with mixed ages and sexes, referring to Mary McCall Bowie, who married Turner Wooten in 1794. Now, due to legal problems or perhaps a desire to divide the estate among the many heirs, Bowie'ville was sold to William J. Berry. Bowie'ville remained in the Berry family until 1935. Our children and grandchildren many of them have not yet made the connection that the earnings generated by the sweat and blood of our ancestors still stands in a corporate form today through these remaining slave plantation houses. But our ways of fighting back were subtle and at the same time large. If we go to the right-hand side, we will see an advertisement, $100 reward. Ran away from the subscriber residing near Nottingham, Prince George's County, almost about 6 weeks hence, a Negro man Ben. He is about 5 feet 8 or 9 inches high, stoutly built, very black, and about 28 years old. He has a father living at Mr. Walter B.C. Worthington's on the Patuxent River and an uncle at Bowieville, about one of which places he may be lurking. Apparently, that's what they thought we did. We lurked when we were trying to get away from slavery's grief. Or he may be in the neighborhood of Hunting Creek in Calvert County, where he was apprehended some years since. He is no doubt in company with the Negro man of Mr. Robert W. Bowie's, who is also a runaway. $50 will be paid for his apprehension if caught in the county, or the above reward if caught out of it. But let me go back just for a second to the last paragraph highlighted on the left-hand side. Due to legal problems or perhaps the desire to divide the estate among the many heirs, Bowieville was sold to Mr. William J. Berry. Bowieville remained in the Berry family until 1935. I mentioned the Berry family because they were another family of well-known slave owners, and their estate was only a few miles away from Upper Marlboro. The Berry family estate was called Mount Calvert. Mount Calvert. Mount Calvert stood near Croom, Maryland. For those of you that may be familiar with the Upper Marlboro and Croom area, where we had one of the first Black aerodromes. So even in the midst of something starting out so inimical to our education, we were still able to have an early air flight system in Croom, Maryland. Again, about 6 miles from Upper Marlboro. I mentioned Upper Marlboro. Yes, there was, in case you ever wondered, and is a Lower Marlboro only a few miles away. But I will leave that for your own curiosity to solve. I've mentioned several times about the life of our ancestors and how they fought back. And of course, in addition to outright physical battling, we also used the Underground Railroad whenever we could. And what you're looking at now from the Port Tobacco Times and Charles County Advertiser from December in 1856. We're looking at several very likely, means they were easy on the eyes, Negroes of both sexes. Horses, cattle, hogs, oxen, you get the idea. Terms of sale for the Negroes: accepted drafts at 4 months, interest added for other property, and for all, seems of and under $10 cash. Jeremiah Townsend. Patrol notice to John W. Guy, Justice of the Peace for Charles County. The undersigned think a patrol necessary for the neighborhood lying on the northwest of Mattawoman Swamp. We have anyone that's familiar with the Waldorf area, Mattawoman Creek, or Hakaya Swamp, running up to the line between Charles and Prince George's counties in Pamunkey Neck, or coming down to the next highlighted area. It is strongly recommended that no person within the limits of our patrol permit his servants to leave his premises at night without a pass. All found without a pass will be rigidly dealt with. There are those historians who believe that instead of looking at the beginnings of modern American policing at how police performed in the cities, that we should go and look at the slave patrols for the beginning of American policing, even if it may make some people today just a little bit uncomfortable. So that we begin not with the cities, but we begin with a patrol system that governed the movements of enslaved and free Black folk. Just as slavery was an important source of wealth in Maryland, the slave trade was an important source in the county level as well. Annapolis was one of the earliest slave ports in the Chesapeake region. By the 17th century, it was a primary port of entry for slaves and other cargo coming to the upper Chesapeake Bay. Slaves were sold on the docks at Annapolis. They were sold in the back of both the Reynolds Tavern at Church Circle and at the Middleton Tavern near the Annapolis docks. Both taverns are still in business, though perhaps their current patrons are not aware of this history. Although the United States had already banned the importation of slaves into the county by 1808, the domestic slave trade thrived, and the trafficking in slaves was an important part of the Baltimore economy. Between 1815 and 1860, Baltimore was one of the leading ports for the sale and shipping of slaves to the Deep South. It is estimated that in those years, some 25 to 30,000 slaves were shipped through the city for resale in the South. Countless thousands more were sold in markets and auction houses that could be found in a district north of what is now the destination of countless tourists, the Inner Harbor. The places in which the slave pens could be found comprised an area roughly bordered by Cove Street on the west, near today's Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, Conway Street on the south, near the Otterbein Church, and the Orioles Park at Camden Yards, and Baltimore Street on the north, and Gay Street on the east, not far from City Hall. Oh, let me go back and mention the name of Samuel Berry again. Samuel Berry, who would ultimately own Bowieville as well as a major plantation in that same area, as you can imagine, was a rock-ribbed supporter of enslavement who was actually put out by Maryland Emancipation. He voted against Maryland Emancipation. He said that freedom for Black people in the state of Maryland would be an outrage to our rights. And he had a few other choice words, but again, he owned Mount Calvert Plantation, still standing near Croom. He also, to make himself perhaps feel better at night, was a frequent user of Bible verses to control his 51 enslaved people. Of the four counties that were the heart of slavery in the state of Maryland, and that would have included some 33,000 enslaved people, 6% of the state's population. It seemed as though the slave owners became haughty and seemed as though they bragged about the fecundity of the ground in that particular slave belt, particularly that of Prince George's County, and the easiness which they claimed brought the tobacco seeds to full flower, if you will. So when we look at this newspaper article, it sort of speaks to that. There was a large meeting of slaveholders on the eastern shore of Maryland. And in those days, that included Prince George's County. It not only went across the water, but in that slavery mindset, it included Prince George's. The speeches of the Honorable Judge Chambers, Senator Pierce, and the Honorable Judge Ricard, the tanning and tar and feathering of a citizen of Kent County, resolutions passed by the meeting, future measures decided upon. A meeting of the citizens of Kent County was held here today, to which those, and Kent was on the water side, if you will, of the county, of adjoining counties were also present, to take into consideration the proper measures to be adopted to promote the better security of their slave property. The particular circumstances which led to the meeting are fully detailed in the remarks of the various speakers as given below. The meeting was numerously attended by leading citizens, and the subject discussed was, of course, of a very exciting character. Judge Chambers was called into the chair, and Dr. F.C. Kennard appointed secretary. It goes on to say, it was not necessary, he said, in the presence to give a detailed history of late events in the county. All were informed of them. Nor was it necessary to enter into the merits of the question whether those who had driven from the county a man universally believed to be engaged in the most criminal and mischievous intercourse with our slaves had executed their purpose in a way to deserve condemnation. He was free to say that he would have advised a perhaps different course, but that is now not the matter commanding attention, right or wrong. That thing was done and could not be undone. The more important inquiry is what is doing and what to be done. And this is simple persiflage that a man who was in favor of abolition was dealt with very harshly. And the fact was then that we were to provide for the protection of slaveholders and the friends of slaveholders against the lawless attacks as well as threats of men who were professing to be friends of law and order while in the most palpable violation of it. Men who manifested their aversion to anything like illegal violence by assaulting and beating their neighbors for essentially no offense. These men had grown haughty, they had grown careless. They believed that their way, based on the permanent enslavement of the sons and daughters of Africa, was the only way they could live. Even traveling on the road was dangerous. From the Anti-Slavery Bugle from 1846, we get justice, free Negroes. 2 free Negroes from the District of Columbia were arrested in this village on Sunday last for coming into the state of Maryland in violation of a law of the last legislature. They were fined $20 each, with some being secured to the informer. They were discharged. The fine under the law for the second offense is $500, one half to the Colonization Society, the other half to the informer. Under the law of 1839, these restrictions were continued and confined rather to free Negroes coming from other states. But the law under which these Negroes were arrested subjects free Negroes from the District of Columbia to all the penalties of the law of 1839. Several arrests have been made under this law, and as few of the parties interested are presumed to know of its existence, it would be well for the district papers to publish this article. Should you want to be free, there were restrictions on how far you could go, and that was, even though it's not taught in the DC public schools, there were a raft of slave laws restricting where blacks could gather, when they could gather, the number in which they could gather. In Georgetown, 7 or more on a street corner, subject to the law. From the May term, 1830, Negro Harry Quando v. Claggett. Claggetts were another family of prosperous slave owners in the state. In the name of God, etc., may after my demise, it will be my will that my woman Maria and all her increase, including the children she now has, to be free and manumitted forever, and that the money that is now due to me be received by Thomas Claggett and for the support of Maria and her children until the last of May next. And I also desire that my woman Rhoda and all her increase to be free and manumitted after serving the term of 2 years, where Elizabeth Osborne shall hire her anywhere in the district, and the hire to be applied to the getting of said children good places to work, paying Elizabeth Osborne for her trouble. My will is that my man Harry is to serve 1 year to any person that will give a fair hire for him, and do have to be applied to the support of Maria and her children, and the other part to himself. In witness thereof, well, you get the idea. Reports of cases, civil and criminal, U.S. District Circuit Court, District of Columbia. But how did our ancestors feel? They would not always desire to wait until someone else decided on their freedom. And so they took to the road. We're not taking to other more violent means. $400 reward, ran away from the subscriber near Upper Marlboro, Prince George's County, on the 24th of August last. Two Negro men, Truman Carter and Isaac Marshall. Truman is about 35 years of age, 5 feet 6 to 10 inches, straight and well made, of dark color. Teeth, usually wears whiskers, though he sometimes cuts them off when he runs away. He has some white hairs around the back of his head. He is a sensible, cunning fellow, and will probably try to make his escape. I purchased him of Mr. Zadok Shelley. He has a wife at Mr. Richards Hills and a brother named Nick, a blacksmith working at Carroll's shop in Nottingham, all of this county. About the latter place, I think he is lurking. Isaac is quite black, very homely, stupid fellow, though he has a good deal of cunning, about 5 feet 7 to 9 inches high, 32 years old. He has a defect in one of his knees, um, occasioned by something falling upon it, which makes the foot stand out and causes him to limp a little when he walks. I purchased him of the estate of the late Governor Kent of this county. He has acquaintances at James Kent's at Pig Point, Anne Arundel County, also at Mr. Keats in Alexandria, District of Columbia. Both went off together and will probably remain together. Thomas Claggett. Thomas Claggett. And if that name seems a little bit familiar, then refer to the above document in the same piece that I'm showing you now. But there were agencies and individuals who wanted everyone to share the benefits of freedom. They believed in a simple creed that all of God's children should be free. And so we have evidence of the slave escape system from a very early period. What you're looking at now are sections of articles from the Frederick Douglass's paper, dated the 25th of May, 1860, with vivid descriptions. I draw your attention to the bottom article, to the Friends of the Fugitive from Slavery, so that you will see that the Reverend J.W. Logan, he, having been slave and fugitive himself, knows best how to provide for that class of sufferers and to guard against imposition. Mr. Logan has agreed to devote himself to this humane work, and he will be one of many. His daughter will also distinguish herself in the fight on what would come to be known as the Underground Railroad. We're very lucky that we had such an artifact that came up for sale just a few years ago. A rare relic of the Underground Railroad, Isaac Skaggs' important runaway slave poster, $500 reward, ran away or decoyed from the subscriber. They would not give our ancestors the common sense notion of being able to distinguish liberty from slavery. No, it had to be, we were we were decoyed away. Or if you read the papers of DeVoe's review, there are articles on how our ancestors who ran away suffered a disability. They suffered from a disease called drapetomania. Drapetomania, the disease, it was defined, of running away, so that they wished to steal agency from us, that they wished that we somehow did not know that bondage was worse than freedom. And so if we stood up and ran off, it was something was wrong with us. So I will give you a moment or two to take a look at this reward poster. Again, this is from Beltsville, Maryland. I have a feeling that some of us know where Beltsville is, but take a moment, if you will, to look at it. Okay, that should do it. $500 reward. Maria and Dal and Lim and Bill and Ben and Adam. So, as much as they wish to say we suffered from some sort of disease, if there was a disease afoot, it was the desire to be free. Ran away from a subscriber living in Bladensburg on Saturday the 6th. A Negro woman named Aggie of the common size, dark copper color, straight and well made. Her feet and ankles are made more like a white woman's than a Negro. I have no idea what that means. She has lost one of her upper front teeth. She has a variety of clothing with her, among which is two white and dark striped homemade woolen frocks, new shoes of good quality, and generally wears a handkerchief around her head as she went off without any provocation. I'll just repeat that one more time. As she went off without any provocation and taking with her all her clothes, she must have assistance or has procured forged papers. I purchased her last summer of Mr. Charles Hill near Upper Marlboro, Prince George's County, as agent for Colonel Crawl. For the apprehension of Aggie, I will give the above reward, including the apprehension fee in Maryland for her confinement in any jail so that I can get her again and deliver it to me. NB, Latin, noto bene. Note well, pay attention. Any information respecting said Negro will be directed to me in Bladensburg. Thomas Baldwin. Just a couple of things to reflect on. If they said we were suffering from some disease, perhaps irrational, then we wonder why it is that she has a variety of clothing with her, among which is two white and dark striped homemade woolen frocks. Even more cogently, new shoes of good quality. And when generally wears a handkerchief around her head, perhaps that was what some Black folk used to call a gele, an item of decoration found all over Mother Africa. And what can we say? As she went off without any provocation and taken with her all her clothes, I don't believe sis planned to come back. I don't believe that this shows some suffering or malady. What this shows is sis was planning, and I believe that she was going to have a good time up north. She was going to party like it was 1849. There was a time when you could go near the inner harbor. There was a desultory, desolate looking building downtown Baltimore at the corner of Pratt and Howard Street. That was the old slave jail. And this is what you're looking at with this, and a couple of items of interest below it. In 1910, a photographer posed two men at the barred window of the former slave jail at Pratt and Howard Street. The building was torn down decades ago, but there were people who remember. There were people who remember. Our ancestors remembered, consistent with an old African proverb. Some of you know it. The axe forgets, but the tree remembers. The axe forgets, but the tree remembers. We know that there was a slave auction block in Fredericksburg. And I talked to an elder many years ago who, as a child, would people would pay her pennies to stand on the auction block. What are we looking at when we look at the institution of enslavement in the state of Maryland and we compare it to other places? And we see that number 13 spot is occupied by Maryland. The free population, it was primarily referring to free whites, but there were Black folk there. And one of the amazing things about the state of Maryland is that even under the oppression of the enslaved system, the number of free Blacks began to grow, particularly in the city of Baltimore. Particularly in the city of Baltimore. We understand that by hook or crook, Black folk increased the number of the free Blacks by 90%, Blacks by 1860. 75% of the city's Black population being free already by 1830. And you can look at some of the other slave population column and some of the others as we move to the next slide. Bear in mind, if you will, please, that Juneteenth did not end slavery, that in fact, you could still find thousands of enslaved people in places like Kentucky well after June of 1865. But this constant contest could not be carried on without some sort of satisfactory resolution. And so it is that the war begins, and this is actually an African American newspaper, Weekly Anglo-African. Okay, attack on the Constitution, meeting of colored men. A notice was issued that a meeting of colored men would be held yesterday evening, 178 Prince Street, for the purpose of tendering their services to the government during the present war. But it was prevented from being held by Captain Hollins of the 8th Ward Detachment of the Metropolitan Police. This is of Baltimore. They did not want Black men who were willing and able to serve to immediately take up arms for the freedom of not only their own people, but for the rescue of the country. And so there was a similar event in Washington, D.C. as well. And as we'll see, it was difficulty for Black men even when they had permission to enlist. To get a sense of how Maryland, if you will, in general, many of the people, even though Maryland would be a border state, some would consider it in the North, not everybody felt that way. And so in the state song, originally, Maryland, My Maryland, by James R. Randall, we find what might surprise some, because the song, the state song, originally referenced no more Northern scum or the tyrant Lincoln. But Maryland has voted in more recent years to get rid of the Civil War insults from the official state song. The Maryland State Senate voted 38-8 to revise the 9-stanza song. Original lyrics refer to Northern scum and refer to Lincoln as tyrant. Also, Sic Semper, which John Wilkes Booth shouted after he shot Lincoln. It was written as a poem in 1861, but only made the state song in when? 1939. The new version will omit entire stanzas that reference the Civil War, and lines about the state's natural beauty will be incorporated instead. This is a pamphlet called written by the mediator between North and South, or the 7 points of the North Star, Thoughts of an American in the Wilderness. Rise, America, the time has arrived. Take the lead in breaking prejudice chains. When custom or doctrines are in the way, self-preservation is the first law of nature. Baltimore, 1862. Partway into this paper are the areas I've highlighted. The time of punishment has arrived and will persecute us until we have found a remedy to cure the evil, which would be how to get rid of the Negroes with a clear conscience and profit to the nation. And so they suggested a series of actions be taken. First, let the U.S. take all colored persons with less than 3/4 white blood for the purpose of redeeming all treasury notes, North and South, and to give pensions to all disabled soldiers, and for the support of the wives and children of deceased soldiers in all the states from Maine to Texas. Second, let every colored child with less than 3/4 white blood born after the year 1874, if male, be castrated, if female, spayed. Item number 3. Slavery of any kind is inconsistent with a republican form of government. Therefore, Negro slavery should be entirely abolished, and all colored persons should be called by no other name than Negro property. And such property should have all the benefits of the Christian religion. Number 4, to suppress the accumulation of riches, luxury, and avarice, the natural consequences of such laws, 1/10 of all the produce of the Negro owners should be given to the poor in Europe. Clear the expense of collecting and distributing those sacrifices. Number 5, with the passage of these laws, all foreigners should be Americanized and put on an equality with the natives after taking the oath of allegiance. No, they do not mean Native Americans. They don't mean the original inhabitants. They refer to native-born whites. Number 6, no more Chinese, Mexican, or other colored races should be permitted to become citizens or residents of the United States. And finally, to extinguish the different nationalities, all European, Chinese, Mexicans, and Indians in the States should not marry in their own nationalities. That is to say, marrying blood relations of the 4th or 5th grade is self-pollution in a small degree. So this was one of the discussed solutions, if you will. Slavery, and Race, suggested by, as he describes himself, Thoughts of an American in the Wilderness. I don't think they teach in schools of St. Mary's County the reported rising of Black people, but we were lucky to have it in the first year of the Civil War. The reported insurrection in St. Mary's County. We published a few days ago an extract from a letter received in Washington from Leonardtown, St. Mary's County, stating that a Negro insurrection plot had been discovered in that vicinity, and the ringleader had been seized and lodged in the jail. In the St. Mary's Beacon, a newspaper, of Thursday, January 31st, we find the following. Committed to jail, Hillary Curtis, free Black, was committed to the county jail on Monday last, 28th instant, by Justice Wathen on the charge of being engaged in an attempt to incite insurrection among the Negroes. John Thompson, free Black, was committed to jail on Thursday last, the 29th instant, on a similar charge. Both Negroes, we believe, are from the Patuxent district. We do not deem it advisable to give the circumstances which led to their arrest until after their examination, which we believe will take place in a few days. For those of you with keen eyes, you may recall another reference in the materials that I showed you about what we will call, and they did in the old days, people that we would call stool pigeons, people that provided information for pay on freedom-seeking Black folk. Here's another example. We know that this went on every place that enslavement existed, that there was a person in D.C., a Black man in D.C., called Stone Street, that was talked about with great disfavor by the elders who remembered slavery as late as the 1930s and 40s. If you have a bit of extra time, one day, and you are all familiar with the intersection of Georgia Avenue and Eastern Avenue, then go, if you will, to that little park, Jessup Blair Park. There you'll find a wayside exhibit on the pavement that will tell you about an event there in August of 1850 and how a carriage of freedom seeking two Black men, one white abolitionist who was driving the carriage, was stopped at the district line. According to some accounts, there may have been a rail thrust through the rear wheel of the carriage. We know the white man was roughly pulled off of the carriage seat and hurled down to the ground. That the freedom seekers had been caught by a posse, possibly aided by an informer. Such was the bloodlust of the posse, ladies and gentlemen, that some of the men who were trying to apprehend them stabbed the doors of the carriage and fired into the carriage. One Black man was wounded but got away. The other one was taken with the driver back down to the city. Then there were those freedom seekers that had, as this article purports to report, the frustrating habit of breaking of our county jail and the escape therefrom of all its inhabitants. On Monday night last, the back wall of the Prince George's County Jail was opened by the removal of the bricks and mortar, affording a hole sufficient to allow all of the inmates to make good their exit. 3 Negro women and 1 man escaped this time, the man for the 3rd time. One remarkable feature of this event is that the man was ironed and chained to the floor in such manner that he could not reach the walls. The opening was made from the outside, and the irons employed to confine the Negro at their place in the floor when the prisoner had escaped. It is proper to say that Mr. Covell, the jailer, as well as Mr. Shackelford, the deputy sheriff, were on the night in question doubly vigilant. The Negro man, having very nearly effected his escape a few nights before by means of the point of a bayonet, which he had somehow secured, they, the jailer and deputy sheriff, had requested a guard to be placed at the jail, which was done. And notwithstanding the efforts of these gentlemen, the prisoners escaped, and our jail was rendered useless. Let what may come. Every room in the jail is now open. Truly, our estimable Sheriff Wheeler has had a terrible series of misfortunes following him in connection with this jail. If any of us have been frustrated at times, one of the worst poisons that we can inflict upon ourselves is to tell our children and grandchildren that we do not stick together. Here's certainly one concrete example of many. With the coming of the war, large numbers of Black people escaped from other parts of the state and came into the city. We have here an image of the arrival of freedmen and their families at Baltimore, Maryland. And this is relatively late in the war. This is from 1865, but from the beginning, Black folk fled to where they believed freedom was easier to obtain, under the guns on Federal Hill, perhaps in Baltimore. Hundreds, if not thousands, flocked to the Union forces and installations. Here we have stereo view of an African-American cook, Army of the Potomac near City Point, Virginia. And there were jobs that soon became disproportionately full of freedom-seeking Black folk. One of them was the undercook. In Section 10, Act of March 3, 1863, it is enacted that the President of the United States be, and he here is by authorized to cause to be enlisted for each cook, two allowed by Section 9, two undercooks of African descent, who shall receive for their full compensation $10 a month and one ration per day. $3 of said monthly pay may be in clothing. For a volunteer company, the two undercooks will be mustered into service as in the cases of other soldiers. In each case, a remark will be made on their enlistment papers showing that they are undercooks of African descent. Already in 1861, Black men were allowed to enlist in the Union Navy. And so that we have large numbers of men, up until at least the number of 18,000 serving in the Union Navy, many of them from the state of Maryland, which provided one of the largest complements of sailors. Here we have a picture of more than 30 Black crewmen, both young and old, on the USS Vermont, at that time on the waters off of Hilton Head, South Carolina. Then in the second year of the war, there was another more cataclysmic blow to the institution of slavery, and that is the abolition of slavery in the nation's capital, the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Not everyone was happy about that. Indeed, most of the white residents were unhappy. But let's go to a newspaper from Frederick, Maryland, as it reported on the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. This is the first step, according to the newspaper, toward the inauguration of the most radical abolition theories, following out this idea the Negro will be placed on equality with the white man. This is we need not argue. People of Maryland certainly never will, at all events during the present generations, countenance tolerate these abolitionist heresies. perhaps what made it worse in terms of the district is that in the nation's capital was given the only instance of compensated emancipation in the history of the United States. And so the people listed here in the left-hand column are the names of the petitioners for payment for their enslaved people. For again, the nature of emancipation in the nation's capital was compensated emancipation, payment for their freedom. Approximately 3,000 people were freed through this mechanism. Many people were convinced that this would be the death knell of slavery, but not yet. Not yet. Slavery went on. This article talks about how although slave trading had been abolished in the city in 1850, slave owning had still continued. But now, with emancipation gone and done the next year, that is to say, that we have abolition in the District of Columbia in April of 1862. Okay. In June of 1862, stay with me now. In June of 1862, slavery was ended in the United States territories. In September of 1862, it was what was called the preliminary emancipation. And then this is, if you will, telling the slave owners, get set, get ready, because on January the 1st, 1863, I'm going to do something else. And so that is the date of, certainly in retrospect, we might call the Emancipation Proclamation an imperfect document, but nevertheless, muscle and strength were given to it by the actions of freedom-seeking sons and daughters of Africa. And it also provided for the recruitment of Black men into the Union Army. Here we have, from that time period, Uncle Abe offering a musket and a packet of balls and powder to one Black man. It is at that time, 1863, that what had been a slow and quiet discussion about emancipation in Maryland begins with renewed vigor. So we have articles like this from 1863, the slaves in Maryland. The military authorities in Baltimore, it appears, have already commenced to put into practice the illegal suggestions, okay, of Judge Bond. And Judge Bond, there were white abolitionists in the state of Maryland, as well as, you can imagine, Black ones. But if we were to have a roll of history, then we would take a look at Judge Hugh Bond, and that the mere discussion of emancipation in the state of Maryland was such a hellfire discussion that already the abolitionist party would be split into, the Emancipation Party would be split into in the state of Maryland. White Maryland Unionists split into the Unconditional Union Party, with spokesmen such as the Baltimore Criminal Court Judge Hugh Bond, Henry Winter Davis, Henry H. Goldsboro, and Henry Hoffman. They wanted quick action on slavery and state constitutional reform. But meanwhile, there were the conservative Unionists, including many from the eastern shore of Maryland and southern Maryland. Republicans and former Democrats favored a more measured approach. So both factions agreed that slavery was doomed, but they split on the recruitment and use of Black soldiers and the speed of abolition. Now, you will recall that Maryland was a border state, so it would not be freed through the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. Texas, for example, although listed in the Emancipation Proclamation, would have to be used by force. And then, of course, we had the other states that would not be freed until the 13th Amendment. This is a letter from a Black woman who lived in Bel Air, Maryland. She wrote directly to Lincoln wanting to know, did slavery still exist? Could she go see her people, as she says in the letter, because her master wouldn't let her go? Lincoln, to my knowledge, never wrote her back, but her question will, by the process of action, be answered on November the 1st, 1864. By this time, the need for more soldiers is apparent. And so Lincoln plays his last best card. From the Punch magazine, October 18th, 1862, Abe Lincoln's last card, or Rouge et Noir, the red on the black, or if you will, as you see depicted on the ace of spades. But there were others who were so worried that if you gave the Black man a musket, he might not follow orders, that he might go crazy on revenge. In fact, in this particular cartoon, the Southerners are portrayed as meek, soft, and mild, and defenseless white kittens, where if you look closely, you will see the black cat has his teeth bared. And if you didn't see it, take a look at the bottom image close up. Not only are these angry cats, black cats, but they are filled with a substance called Lincoln's blackstrap molasses. Lincoln's blackstrap molasses. The title of the above illustration, The Great Remedy, the date on the bottle of Lincoln's blackstrap, and the picture of cats labeled Contraband, Jeff Davis, and Abe all suggest that emancipation was designed to bring Black troops into the Union Army. The depiction of African Americans as sharp-toothed black cats appearing to growl as it eyed a soft-looking white cat labeled Jeff Davis seemed to reflect the belief that Black soldiers would be savage and vindictive. But the item, the blessed language in the Emancipation Proclamation allowed for the whole-scale recruitment of Black soldiers bore fruit almost immediately. Here from a German publication is a picture of Black recruits signing up to fight for their freedom. And there would be regiments established in the state of Maryland as well. In fact, a series of recruiting stations would be established all over the state. And planters on the Patuxent River, having found that a large armed Negro force had already been recruited, were unhappy. But this was the force of history and could not be stopped. You may have visited some of the sites of the recruitment of what would come to be known as the U.S. colored troops. And in Maryland, they would be recruited from Baltimore, Havre de Grace, Broad Creek, Chestertown, Queenstown, for those of you who might recall a certain mall on 50 Oxford in Talbot County, Slaughters Creek in Dorchester County, Princess Anne Wharf in Somerset County, Forest Wharf in St. Mary's County, Leonardtown, St. Mary's County, Benedict in Charles County, Lower Marlboro in Calvert County, Monocacy in Frederick County. Well, you kind of get the idea. War Department, Adjutant General's Office, Baltimore, Maryland. By direction of the Secretary of War, you are hereby authorized to raise in the city of Baltimore and vicinity a regiment of colored troops. Said regiment to be known and designated as the 39th Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops, to be composed of colored men and be mustered into the service of the United States for 3 years or during the war. To these troops, no bounties will be paid. They will receive $10 a month in one ration, $3 of which monthly pay may be in clothing. Ultimately, there will be half a dozen different regiments of Black men from Maryland. But recruitment would not be easy. Assault on Negro recruits. Yesterday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, a squad of about 50 Negroes from Anne Arundel County, under guard of 2 companies of Black soldiers, were marched along Calvert Street to Baltimore and thence to Holiday Street above Fayette, the headquarters of Colonel Bowman. While passing into Holiday Street, several soldiers connected with the Maryland regiments hooted at them and used all manner of epithets against them, and some hurling bricks among them. This behavior of the white soldiers did not please a few of the bystanders, and they had some of the soldiers arrested. Frederick Locke, Lewis Lynch, Thomas Johnson, and Lemuel Brown, who were taken to the station house and held for a hearing today by Justice Hiss. So, in other words, oftentimes, and this happened in the nation's capital as well, Black men who were prepared to lay their bodies on the altar of freedom, as well as fight for the reunification of the country, received a cold reception. And they were often cursed at and attacked. I'd like to introduce you to one of the early Black doctors and an officer in the Union Army, a colored surgeon named Alexander G. Augusta. He's buried with honor at the Arlington National Cemetery. He came out of Maryland. It is to say, he would be trained and recruited in part in the state of Maryland, served in the state of Maryland, an officer of the U.S. colored troops. He would be shamefully treated on public conveyances, even with his uniform on, but he did not let them stop him. And after the war, he would be on the medical faculty of Howard University. Alexander Augusta. For those of you who, with good eyesight, may be able to look at the lower left-hand corner of the illustration, I've included from the National Republican newspaper a list of the faculty of Howard University Medical Department: Charles B. Purvis and Alexander Augusta, 2 Black doctors that taught at Howard. There would be 2 white physicians that would, if you pardon the expression, catch it for teaching medicine at Howard University near the same time. Their name was Loomis and Redburn. Headquarters for recruiting colored troops, southeast corner of Baltimore and Charles Streets. Entrance on Charles Streets. Another way that slave owning Union supporters could make a little money for themselves is to provide the evidence of their title and then get their Black man to enlist and they would be compensated. In this case, for compensation for the war service of her slave, Alfred Thompson, a white woman named Elizabeth Mercer of Howard County, Maryland, would be compensated. One of the largest training facilities was in Southern Maryland, Camp Stanton, established in this area October 1863 for the recruiting and training of the 7th, 9th, 19th, and 30th U.S. colored troops. There were songs made up about what was going on at Camp Stanton. People were deeply touched by what was going on at Camp Stanton, and anyone familiar with the geography would learn that some troops marched from Camp Stanton into Washington, D.C. I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with the intersection of New York Avenue and the 3rd Street Tunnel. If you are familiar at all with the intersection of New York Avenue and the 3rd Street Tunnel, before you make that right into the tunnel or continue directly on New York Avenue, perhaps at a light, don't do it when the light's not red, take a look to the left. Just take a look to the left. There is a small church right there, a small church in which a Black man who would serve in the Union Army, born in the state of Maryland, would serve. He's Prophet William Saunders Crowdy would preach out of that little small church right there. Again, where? On New York Avenue, as you turn into the 3rd Street Tunnel. Take a look the next time you're up there. The other gentleman, okay, would be Robert Riley, and he was also from the state of Maryland as well, Anne Arundel County. U.S. forces no longer to be employed in catching fugitive slaves. Now they would fight alongside them. The governors of Maryland would slowly, inexorably be dragged toward freedom for Black people in Maryland. And they would have a multiplicity of examples of Black bravery submitted for your examination. Christian A. Fleetwood, this well-educated Baltimorean, Sergeant Major, 4th U.S. Colored Troops, composed largely of free Blacks from the state of Maryland. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor, then as now, our nation's highest award for military bravery. As a matter of fact, he's wearing on his uniform. After war, he would go into a community already full of pride. You'll know it, LaDroit Park. The 4th USCT, the regiment in which Fleetwood served. But there would be people who would resist to the end the idea of freedom for Black people in Maryland, the loss of 80,000 freedom-seeking enslaved people, the freedom of, but we know that ultimately for this thing to be passed, it has to be entered into the state constitution. And despite the discourse over whether it should or should not, ultimately forces in the state allowed it to be put as a measure for the state constitution, the Constitution of 1864. It was close all the way. Here's the vote on the Maryland State Constitution, for and against. And as we can see, the majority of people voted against, but it wasn't enough to carry. And this is when you add the votes of the Union soldiers, that pushed it over the line. That pushed it over the line, and not by many. By 375 votes, Black folks' freedom was put into the Constitution in 1864 of the state of Maryland. It could now finally be called the Free State in truth. Emancipation Day, November the 1st, 1864. The colored portion of our community converted yesterday into a day of holiday, thanksgiving, and prayer. During the day, they donned their best attire and social reunions were indulged in extensively. The various churches were thronged during the entire day. And at the church on Saratoga Street, the scene was one of peculiar interest. The place was crowded, and at times it was impossible for a vehicle to pass along the street. So dense was the mass of persons. According to the requests of the mayor, the bells of the city at sunrise yesterday pealed forth their joyful sound that Maryland was at last a free state. The sounds of the bells had not died away, for loudmouth cannon from all sections of the city echoed with their salvos that henceforth slavery shall have no foothold upon the soil of our fair state. At noon and sundown, the same program was observed. Hundreds of flags floated from the shipping and private residences, and citizens appeared to enjoy the occasion in the true light of a grand holiday. At the Baltimore City Jail, there were 3 females and 1 male confined on the charge of being runaway slaves. They were brought into the criminal court by the order of Judge Bond, who informed them that for the future, they were free people. Maryland, a free state. Governor Bradford, having declared the new Constitution adopted by the popular vote, it went into effect on Tuesday last, November the 1st. By it, slavery is at once at an end in the state. But some of the slaveholders mean to hold on to their people in order to test the legality of emancipation before the courts. Under the direction of the city councils of Baltimore, 500 guns were fired, bells rung, and flags displayed in that city on Tuesday to attest to the joy of the people at their great deliverance. Just a day or two before Maryland Emancipation Day, Sojourner Truth visited the White House. Lincoln showed her a Bible presented to him by the colored people of Baltimore. It is a beautiful, beyond description book. That Bible is now the property of Fisk University. There were a multitude of Black folk that gave prayer and thanks in a number of ways. The great poet, if you're unfamiliar with her work, please get hold of this Black Maryland native, Mrs. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Her best known work, Iola Leroy. Iola, I-O-L-A, Leroy. Reading what the sister says. And you got to start where it begins. Start in the first chapter, y'all, because it begins with the mystery of market speech. And she goes into a discussion of the tactics used in verbal code by Black folk during the Civil War. I won't tell you any more than that. But for those who think Black people didn't know about the war's end, of course, many did. It was just nothing in certain places in the United States they could do about it, like Texas. But they had ways of listening in. Even in Texas, they still tell the story of a lady named Tempe Cummins, who had a strategic spot on the exterior of her master's cabin where she could stay conversing with what was going on in the war. When she heard that freedom came to Texas, she was joyful beyond description. She couldn't contain herself. And on her master's plantation, when she could have been killed in many parts of Texas, she couldn't. She took the risk. She began to yell from the corner of the master's house that they were free. Tempe Cummins was her name. She had to run out off the master's property because he took out a musket and fired it at her, but she would be reunited with her children soon. Well, we're almost done here this evening. There would be other celebrations because this was seen again as another nail in the coffin of slavery and a closer end to the Civil War. To be sure, there were people who believed that and who would institute ways to keep particularly black children in Maryland enslaved. They just called it other things. Okay. And so this was a trick not only used in Maryland, but other places, but ultimately it would fall to the tide of history. There was a particularly moving event 16 days after Maryland Emancipation, when Frederick Douglass came to a church in Baltimore. Again, it took Douglass 16 days after the Maryland Emancipation to return to Baltimore for the first time since he had left it as a fugitive. 16 days. He went to Bethel AME Church, held his sister's hand, Eliza Bailey Mitchell, as he walked down the central aisle of the church. He had not seen his sister in 30 years. But there would be games announced in Maryland. Lower labor, if you don't mind me saying tricky wages, but all that would be fought against ultimately. The war ultimately would end in the state of Maryland. And we close by focusing on the fact that these half dozen regiments of soldiers from the state of Maryland fighting alongside other regiments of black soldiers and the service of some 18,000 at least black Union sailors would lead to the ultimate victory over slavery. But if we went to places like the Battle of the Crater, Petersburg, Virginia, we would see that black men were prepared to lay down their lives for the freedom of black people and for the salvation of the country, the unification of the country, which is something that Du Bois wrote about in his book, Black Reconstruction. Maryland black soldier to mother of a dead comrade, because the thousands of casualties and the suffering of black people, you just did not hear about it, but it went on. You inquired about Mr. Young. He went to the hospital. I cannot give you any other information. Billy's things that you requested to inquire about, I can get no information, as in the bustle of battle, everything was lost. Not what a mother would want to hear, but it was part of the price paid for black freedom. Maryland redeemed. The new Constitution carried. The soldiers' vote decided its adoption. But as I said, there will be others who wish to have slavery carried on through the courts and in the front yards of the former plantations for as long as possible. This is a letter from a woman, a Maryland freed woman, Jane Camper. I was the slave of Mr. William Townsend of Talbot County, and told Mr. Townsend of my having become free and desired my master to give my children and my bedclothes. He told me that I was free, but that my children should be bound to him. One of the tricks. He locked my children up so I could not find them. I afterwards got my children by stealth and brought them to Baltimore. I desired to regain possession of my bedclothes and furniture. My master pursued me to the boat to get possession of my children, but I hid them on the boat. And so every November 1st, 1864, that day remains sacred in the precincts of the state of Maryland. We bring it out to remind you. It used to be celebrated and still is in one particular part. I implore you that the next time you're on Route 50, heading toward the beaches, a few miles outside Cambridge, Maryland, you're going to come to an intersection. It's a one-stop intersection. Typical country town, but this country town is made special because it's the town of Trapp, Maryland, is where one of the oldest celebrations of Maryland emancipation is still being conducted. If you go to Trapp, they celebrate Maryland Emancipation Day. It was until recently celebrated as close to DC as the Laurel, Maryland. Today, with the 1864 anniversary, more places are acknowledging Maryland emancipation. They're acknowledging the role of Black soldiers. They take pride in the fact that General Grant said that of the Negro troops for guard duty and for picket duty on the march and in an assault, I consider the Negro troops surpassed by no soldiers in the world and equaled by very few. U.S. colored troops in Maryland and throughout the South, less tangible examples of their presence and service. Unionville, Maryland, founded by Black Union veterans in Talbot County. And there are some statues also in honor of the activities and service of Black Maryland regiments. North Brentwood, Maryland, just off Rhode Island Avenue, just outside the DC line, was set aside to honor the services of Black soldiers from the state of Maryland. North Brentwood, Maryland. Several of the white officers wrote stories of their service with Black soldiers from the state of Maryland and other places. Douglass was always proud of the soldiers from his native state and the courage and intrepidity that they had shown. But now there was a new battle, the fight for civil rights. There were those who would say that even today the battle continues. But in Lexington Park, Maryland, we have a statue of the U.S. colored troops from St. Mary's County. We have a Chestertown in Kent County, an obelisk in honor of the Black soldiers. And of course, we acknowledge the services of the U.S. colored troops and how they helped to transform the country. Indeed, perhaps beyond that, by showing that Black soldiers would and could fight. So what we do is hold the 1st of Maryland with honor. We acknowledge those who have served. We remember the small town of Trapp. I put it on the map, y'all. Trappe, that still honors Maryland emancipation so long after the first celebration. We honor the 4th U.S. colored troops among the many regiments. No one handed us freedom. We purchased it through our blood and valor. And in 2014, another anniversary of Maryland emancipation, a group of African American men and women put together a quilt in honor of each county of the state of Maryland. What we've done then, brothers and sisters, is to talk about the hard road to freedom, the story of slavery and emancipation in what can now be called truly the free state. I thank you for your attention. I'll take any questions that you may have. Don't forget, we'll be doing this again, God willing, and the creek don't rise. We do this once a month, and we'll have another true story for you from Black history, from the past, or perhaps indeed even from the present. Thank you very much.